Yeah, so just briefly, what's the difference of the research on mycelium versus the fruiting body in terms of medicinal active constituents?
Sure. So when we look at the overarching literature, the majority of it is done on mushroom extracts, typically hot water extraction. And extraction is done just so that the cell wall of these fungal species can really get broken down. So the cell wall is actually made up of chitin, which is the same material that crustaceans make their shell out of. So it's this very tough substance that we have a hard time digesting, which makes eating fresh mushrooms a very good source of dietary fiber because it'll just won't go through the stomach, doesn't get processed too much, but then ends up feeding our gut. But if we really want to get access to those active compounds, the important constituents in there, we need to do an extraction on this to break down that cell wall first, so we can access those compounds easier. And when it comes to mushrooms and mycelium, so there's different ways to grow mycelium for one. So you can grow it in a solid substrate or you can grow it in a liquid substrate. Typically, when you look at the research, most of it has been done on liquid culture mycelium. So this is, you grow the mycelium in a liquid vat of nutrients. It's usually sugars and proteins, and it'll grow out this mycelium cake. If you think of like maybe tofu or something like that, and then at the end of the process, you can drain off all the water, and then you have this pure cake of mycelium, which you can dry and you can powder. And so this is primarily how they grow mycelium in Asia. And as most of the research on medicinal mushrooms comes out of Asia, most of the research on mycelium is based off this liquid culture mycelium. But what's commonly grown here in the North American market is using a solid substrate. So a solid substrate, if you know of the food product tempeh, tempeh is a soy product where they take cooked soybeans and they inject a fungus onto it and they grow out this sort of white grain cake, and they sell that as food product. And this is a similar process where we're taking something like, say, reishi mycelium, we're injecting that into sterilized grain. This could be rice or oats. And then that's growing out into this sort of grain log here that then gets dried and powdered and sold as a mushroom supplement. And you have that entire grain substrate that still ends up being part of the final product. And this conflicts with the existing literature because the majority of it's based on that liquid substrate, mycelium, that I just talked about. And so these two are very different. And so it's, when you look out into the marketplace, when people are talking about mycelium, they're usually pointing to research that's based off liquid fermentation mycelium, but then they're pointing to a product that's made from solid state mycelium. So there's this kind of contrast there. But when you look into the body of research, a lot of it is based around the mushroom, so the fruit body, which has been extracted in some sort of way, most likely hot water and or alcohol. And this, like, oh man, I was going for a long time. So when we look at the overarching literature and research on mushrooms and mycelium, we see typically hot water extractions based off the mushroom, and the mycelium is usually based off liquid fermentation mycelium.
So yeah, so in the bits of research that I've seen is that basically when you test these products that are mycelium, they're mostly starch because they're grown on a grain. And so there is not much of the active constituents there.
Yeah, that's correct. So the grain actually becomes the dominant ingredient in the product, and that translates to a high amount of starch and a small amount of the medicinal compounds, things like beta-glucans or ergosterol, that are much more common in the mushroom itself.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. And this is definitely different. So if you think about, we were just talking about turkey tail, there's, PSP and PSK, which commonly get cited. Both of these are anti-cancer drugs in Japan and China. And they're actually both made from mycelium. And so it's liquid fermentation mycelium that they're growing in a liquid, but then they're also taking a further step where they're then concentrating and isolating certain compounds to increase the levels. And so they're very different than what you would traditionally see in the North American marketplace when we're talking about mycelium products. So it's always good to differentiate the two and really separate that out. Similar for cordyceps as well. If you look at Cordyceps Cs4, so Cs4 is a product out of China when they were trying to learn how to cultivate Cordyceps sinensis. They couldn't figure out how to get it to grow a fruiting body, so they ended up with growing the mycelium in liquid, which turned into Cordyceps Cs4. And we've seen nutritional analysis as well as analysis on the active compounds that have very drastic differences between the pure mycelium and mycelium that's been cultivated on a grain, where the grain becomes the dominant ingredient.